In 1989, Namco released one of my favorite arcade titles in North America, Splatterhouse. Combining a number of pop culture horror references, it was a gruesome action game where you must rescue your girlfriend from certain doom. The setting was awesome, a spooky mansion full of evil creatures that needed to be gutted in order for you to see the ending. When it came home to the TurboGrafx-16 a year later, it was a big reason why I wanted that console. That port was incredible, capturing much of the appeal of the arcade, right down to enemies exploding into piles of goo. A few years would go by without a sequel to this great game, but in 1992, Namco finally published one. Not in the arcade or on the Turbo, but instead on the Sega Genesis of all places. Namco didn't develop this one in-house, instead it was done by Now Production, a Japanese developer who had done the god-awful Quad Challenge the previous year. Different platform and a different developer. Could it possibly live up to the fun and excitement of the original? Let's find out. The end of the first Splatterhouse was a shocker, the kind of ending you remember because video games were always happy affairs once the credits rolled. The story of Splatterhouse 2 directly continues those events. Rick, the protagonist from the original game, is haunted by visions of the mask, telling him that his girlfriend Jennifer doesn't have to be dead and he can go back and save her. Rick, torn apart by his guilt, decides he's gonna do it, and so Splatterhouse 2 begins. The gameplay here has seen little in the way of change or refinement. Rick still has pretty much the gameplay he had in the first. You have just two buttons to worry about in this one. One attacks and one jumps. When Rick is standing, the attack is a simple punch. When ducking, it's a kick. He can also jump kick and has a slide attack if you hold a diagonal down position after you jump. But the real meat of Splatterhouse 2's gameplay are the weapons you have access to during the adventure. Rick can use pipes, bones, chainsaws, shotguns, and even beakers of potassium bombs to help him get Jennifer back. Unfortunately, the stronger of these items have very limited ammunition and you'll need to use them sparingly and at the right times to get the most out of them. Enemies range from the easily dispatched zombie to massive horrors that can fill half the screen. With the mansion from the first game destroyed, you must fight your way past it to the new house. You don't actually find where Jennifer's soul is trapped until stage 5, which means the majority of this adventure takes place on outside stages. While most of it is on foot, you do occasionally get an elevator or boat ride to change up the setting a tad. The challenge is manageable, especially with a password system that gets you back to the last stage you played. The original TurboGrafx-16 version did a fine job recreating the arcade, and while the Genesis effort here doesn't have a comparable release to pull inspiration from, it's still a solid representation from what you'd expect in a sequel. The locations are suitably creepy, the main character sprite looks the part, and since the original game was kinda dark and dreary, the Genesis color palette doesn't strangle the visual assets otherwise. To its credit, we do see some of the trademark staples of the Genesis hardware at work. There are a few stages with some very nice parallax effects, some of the bosses are huge, and the animation is suitably gruesome thanks to the 8MB cartridge. I think it holds up well visually next to the original, and overall is about what I was expecting. There are a few crappy visual aspects you must deal with that has some nasty fake transparencies that look just terrible on a modern display. But you guys know the deal here. A quality CRT with composite and you'd have a very different outlook. My only real complaint in this department is that perhaps the developers played it a bit too safe on some of the stages. Some repeat assets entirely too often, and the flatness of the backdrops you play against just doesn't scream out that it's a Genesis game. Some line scrolling effects really could have made these areas pop. Still, for 1992, I think the graphics are overall nice and hold up quite well. The sound in Splatterhouse 2 is a real mixed bag. There are some tracks here that really stand out and fit the mood and setting beautifully. No joke, they are just as strong as the Turbo original. But this also has some of the most ear-piercing sound effects you've ever heard, marring an otherwise winning presentation. The voice samples suck too. Let's get a few examples going so you can see what I mean. The original Splatterhouse is one of my favorite games on the TurboGrafx-16, and as much as I enjoyed this one, I cannot say the same for it. The formula was respected here and the end product does what it needs to be a solid sequel. But was it enough? I think the developers may have stuck too close to the original script. There aren't any great strides made in any one area to really make it stand out. It pretty much looks and plays like the arcade did 4 years earlier. This will have a profound effect on some of you, as the shock appeal of its blood and guts just doesn't have the same impact now. The mixed bag sound and music is another spot of contention. While some of what's here is excellent, the stuff that is less than ideal really sticks out. So much so that there are stretches of gameplay where I genuinely turn the volume down to avoid it. But there is something to be said about celebrating simplicity. While I was a younger man, I was always searching for new and unique experiences in gaming. But now that I'm older and my time limited, I'm finding that the tried and true experiences tend to hold up quite well. While lacking anything truly revolutionary, Splatterhouse 2 proudly sticks to its arcade roots and has no shame continuing that journey. Your experience with it will likely hinge on how much you enjoyed the original and how you expected a sequel to play out. If you wanted more of the same, this should satiate those expectations. But if you wanted an evolution of gameplay that saw a ton of changes, this one will likely disappoint. Like many games of the time, Splatterhouse 2 saw numerous changes when it was localized for Western markets. It starts with the artwork for the case. Whoa, what a difference! I much prefer the look of the Japanese edition by a mile. From there, changes fall into little things like the title screens being different and the mask on Rick having a different design aesthetic, to some pretty major changes like the Japanese version not having a password system and limited continues. Finally, the number of lives and the amount of health you start with is notably different between the two. In Japan, you start with less lives but more hearts, while the opposite was true of the Western variant. For those interested, the Japanese version is completely in English, making it an easy one to import. Splatterhouse 2 is not cheap to collect in 2021. A complete in-box set usually goes north of $200, making this an emulation-first demo if you've never played it before. It must have sold well because Namco got Now Production to do a sequel to it in 1993, a 16 megabit beat-em-up that changed the core gameplay design quite a bit. But the burning question is, do I recommend you play Splatterhouse 2 today? Absolutely. I think as far as sequels go, it did a good job capturing the arcade original spirit, and its simplicity is actually a bonus for what it was. This one is easy to pick up for 15 minutes here and there, and once you get good, you can beat the entire thing in 30 minutes. But don't feel bad if you didn't like it as much as I did. Splatterhouse 2 was a contentious game, even at its release. Publications like GamePro loved it, showering it with praise across the board. But it also received some crushing critiques from the likes of Sega Pro, who absolutely shat on it with almost nothing good to say. In my time as Sega Lord X, I've seen similar variants in opinions among my subscribers. Some love it for sticking so close to formula, while others found it a bore fest. Even so, if you have yet to play it, I highly recommend you at least give it a go once to see if it's your type of thing. I love these types of games for their accessibility and pick up and play qualities. You just don't need to spend a lot of time with it to get some enjoyment out of it. Arcade games may be simple, but at least you won't spend 30 minutes of your life looking at cinematics, credits, or tutorials you can't skip just to play the damn thing. I'm Sega Lord X, thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.